Miss Marple and the Mystery That Almost Broke Her. Chapter 1. A letter from the past. The morning was crisp, the kind Miss Marple always found agreeable. She had just settled with her knitting and a fresh cup of tea when the post arrived. A few ordinary letters, bills, a note from her niece, and then one that stood out. The envelope was thick, the paper expensive but slightly yellowed with age. The handwriting, though elegant, bore signs of an unsteady hand. Eleanor Carstairs, a name from long ago. Miss Marple carefully unfolded the letter, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though written in haste or distress. My dear Miss Marple, I write to you in some urgency. There are matters I must discuss, things I should have spoken of long ago but feared to. I have lived with shadows, and now I fear one has finally found me. Please, if you can spare the time, come to Carstairs Manor. I do not believe I am safe. There was no further explanation, no mention of what threatened her. But Miss Marple did not need more. She had read enough letters in her time to recognize true fear when she saw it. Setting the paper down, she gazed out the window, her mind already piecing together fragments of memory. Eleanor Carstairs had once been a striking woman, the sort who commanded attention without effort. That she was now reduced to desperation spoke volumes. Something dreadful had unsettled Eleanor, something she had kept hidden for years. And now it had found its way back to her. The village of St. Mary Mead had long been familiar with quiet tragedies, lives upended by small, seemingly insignificant moments. Miss Marple had always believed that the past had a way of resurfacing, no matter how deep it was buried. She turned Eleanor's letter over in her hands, considering the weight of what was unsaid. Shadows, Eleanor had written. What kind of shadows? A secret long buried? A mistake that refused to be forgotten? Eleanor had never been the type for dramatics. If she was writing now, after all these years, then whatever haunted her must be real. Miss Marple had heard whispers, of course, hushed gossip about Eleanor Carstairs, a woman once admired, then suddenly withdrawn from society. There had been talk of a tragedy in her youth, something to do with a girl who had vanished. Cecilia. Yes, that was her name. But the details were vague, lost in time and the polite silence of the English countryside. And yet, Eleanor had reached out, not to the police, not to an old friend, but to her. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully, her decision already made. She would go to Carstairs Manor. But before she could make arrangements, news arrived that changed everything. At the post office, Mrs. Jenkins, the postmistress, leaned in over the counter, her voice hushed, yet urgent. Terrible news, Miss Marple. About Eleanor Carstairs. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her handbag. Oh? Mrs. Jenkins lowered her voice further. Dead. Found in the garden of Carstairs Manor early this morning. Poor thing. They say it was an accident, but... She hesitated as though already doubting the official explanation. An accident? Miss Marple had seen enough of life to know that such things were rarely so simple. A woman who feared for her life had reached out to her, only to die before she could speak. That was no accident. That was silence, deliberate, timely, and absolute. Who found her? She asked gently. Her housekeeper, Lydia Fairfax, said Miss Carstairs must have slipped and hit her head, but... Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. It doesn't sit right with me, Miss Marple. Nor with her. Miss Marple stepped out into the cold morning air, the letter still in her pocket. What had Eleanor been so afraid of? What had she discovered or remembered that had sealed her fate? As she walked back to her cottage, Miss Marple's eyes darkened with thought. This was no accident, and she intended to prove it. Carstairs Manor loomed ahead, its once grand facade softened by ivy and time. The house bore the quiet dignity of age, yet there was something uneasy about it now, a stillness that did not feel natural. Miss Marple stepped through the heavy oak doors, her presence met with hesitant glances. Lydia Fairfax, Eleanor's long-serving housekeeper, stood stiffly in the dimly lit hall, her eyes shadowed with something unreadable. "You'll be wanting to see the study," Lydia said at last. Her voice was even, but her hands twisted at the folds of her apron. Miss Marple inclined her head, taking in the small details. A table polished but untouched, a vase of wilted flowers, the faint scent of old paper, and something else beneath it, something bitter. Julian Carstairs, Eleanor's nephew, appeared from the drawing room. He was a man who wore his inheritance in the lines of his suit, yet his expression was far from composed. "A dreadful accident, Miss Marple," he said quickly, as if rehearsed. "Quite the tragedy." Miss Marple observed the too swift way he looked away, the impatience in his stance. It was the look of a man who wished a matter closed. The others she met were much the same. Polite, somber, yet carefully distant. It was not grief that filled this house. It was something else entirely. And Miss Marple had learned long ago that in houses such as these, the dead rarely rested easy. Eleanor's study was neat, as one would expect, but there was something curiously out of place. A locked drawer, its key left carelessly in the open. Miss Marple did not believe in carelessness. Inside she found letters, old receipts, and among them, a single folded note. The paper was fragile, the ink faded but still legible. "She knows the truth, but does she remember?" Miss Marple read the words twice, then a third time, turning them over in her mind. Not a statement, but a question. A warning, perhaps. Had Eleanor known something dangerous? Or had she only just begun to remember it? Lydia lingered in the doorway, her eyes flicking towards the paper in Miss Marple's hand. Miss Carstairs, she was troubled, you understand," Lydia said hesitantly. "She would write things down, things that didn't always make sense." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the note carefully away. But it made perfect sense to her. The past had been knocking at Eleanor's door, and now, it seemed, it had finally broken through. Chapter 2. The House of Secrets. The road to Carstairs Manor wound through bare fields, the skeletal branches of ancient oak stretching towards the sky like grasping fingers. The house itself, when it finally emerged from behind the trees, was grand in structure but weary in spirit. The windows, once polished to brilliance, seemed clouded now, as if reluctant to see what lay before them. Miss Marple stepped out of the carriage, adjusting her gloves as she took in the sight. Age had settled heavily upon the estate, yet its decay did not speak of simple neglect. It was a place where time had frozen, trapping secrets within its walls. The front door creaked open before she could knock. Lydia Fairfax, the housekeeper, stood in the threshold, her features carefully arranged into a mask of professionalism. But Miss Marple noticed the small signs, the tension in her jaw, the slight hesitation before she stepped aside. "Miss Marple," Lydia said quietly, "we weren't expecting visitors." "I imagine not," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and faded perfume, and something else beneath it, a faint trace of unease, lingering like dust on forgotten furniture. A grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, marking the passage of time in a house that otherwise felt untouched by it. Miss Marple had visited many such homes in her time, homes where tragedies did not simply occur, but lingered, and Carstairs Manor was one of them. Lydia Fairfax led the way through the dimly lit hall, her steps measured, her shoulders squared with the quiet resolve of a woman who had served in this house long enough to understand its shadows. She was a woman accustomed to silence, yet Miss Marple could sense the weight of words left unspoken. "You were with Miss Carstairs for many years," Miss Marple said gently. Lydia's hands tightened at her sides, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her face. "I was." "Then you must have known her well." A pause. Then, "As well as anyone could." Miss Marple observed her carefully. There was grief, yes, but it was layered beneath something else. Caution, perhaps, or fear. Lydia's eyes flickered towards the staircase before returning to Miss Marple's. She wasn't herself these past few weeks, she admitted finally. Kept saying she heard things, that someone had been in the house. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Fear often left its fingerprints behind. Not in grand gestures, but in the quiet tremble of a voice, the watchful glances over one's shoulder. And Lydia Fairfax was a woman who had learned to be watchful. Julian Carstairs was waiting in the drawing-room, standing by the fireplace as though he sought its warmth, yet did not quite dare to step too close. He turned as Miss Marple entered, his smile carefully practiced, his posture one of affected nonchalance. But his eyes betrayed him. They were the eyes of a man accustomed to worry, the kind that came not from grief, but from debts, from pressures unseen, yet always felt. "A terrible business, this," he said, his voice smooth but lacking true sentiment. "My dear aunt, quite the tragedy." Miss Marple inclined her head, her gaze steady. "Yes, quite." Julian's fingers tapped idly against the mantelpiece, a restless movement. "I imagine the authorities will soon close the matter. An accident, they said. A statement, not a question." Miss Marple clasped her hands before her. "And do you believe it was an accident, Mr. Carstairs?" There was the briefest flicker, a tightening of the jaw, a glance towards the door as if measuring his escape. Then the smile returned. "Of course," he said lightly. "What else could it be?" Miss Marple offered a small, knowing smile in return. What else, indeed? Dr. Miles Barton was a man of precision, neatly pressed trousers, polished shoes, and a manner that suggested efficiency over sentiment. He greeted Miss Marple with the clipped tones of someone accustomed to being unquestioned. "A dreadful accident," he said, barely concealing his impatience. "Miss Carstairs was elderly. A simple misstep, nothing more." Miss Marple studied him carefully. "And you're quite certain, Doctor?" He exhaled sharply, straightening his cuffs. The cause of death was clear. A fall. No signs of struggle, no indications of foul play. Too quick, too certain. His words carried the ring of a man eager to close a case before it could be opened. Miss Marple tilted her head. "No hesitation at all?" Dr. Barton hesitated then, just for a fraction of a second. "Miss Marple, in my profession, one must rely on evidence, not speculation. A reasonable sentiment, and yet..." Miss Marple had learned that haste was its own kind of clue. People rushed to dismiss only what they feared to examine too closely. And Dr. Barton, for all his certainty, was in rather a hurry to move past the subject. Alice and Henry Forsyth had lived near Carstairs Manor for over 3 decades, yet their presence at Eleanor's wake was curiously subdued. Henry, a stout man with thinning hair, kept to the edges of conversation, his gaze darting toward his wife as if seeking silent approval. Alice, by contrast, was poised, her fingers wrapped tightly around the stem of a wineglass, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple, ever gentle in her inquiries, approached them with the air of an old friend. "You must have known Miss Carstairs well," she remarked. Alice's lips curled into a tight smile. "As well as one knows a neighbor." Henry cleared his throat. "A terrible business," he muttered. "Terrible." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his voice, the way Alice's grip on her glass tightened at the word. Grief did not look like this. Grief did not avoid eye contact, nor did it glance toward the doors, as if eager to escape. "It must be unsettling," Miss Marple continued, "to lose someone so suddenly." Alice's smile didn't waver, but her voice dropped ever so slightly. "Unsettling, yes. But some things are best left undisturbed." Miss Marple gave a small nod, as if in agreement, but she had heard such words before, and they rarely belonged to those with nothing to hide. As the evening waned, Miss Marple found herself in the dimly lit hallway of Carstairs Manor, the heavy silence pressing in around her. Lydia Fairfax had retired early, Julian had made his polite exit, and the Forsyths had left as swiftly as decorum allowed. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock remained, marking time in a house that felt as though it had stopped long ago. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against the smooth wooden railing of the staircase. Somewhere in these walls lay the answer, not just to Eleanor's death, but to something much older, something that had been waiting in the shadows for decades. She glanced at the study door, still slightly ajar from earlier. Inside, papers lay untouched, the remnants of a life suddenly cut short, and somewhere among them, a truth that someone had been willing to kill for. Eleanor's death was not merely misfortune, it was unfinished business, and Miss Marple had every intention of seeing it through to its end. Chapter 3. A Whisper of the Past. Lydia Fairfax hesitated, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot just beyond Miss Marple's shoulder. "I shouldn't be speaking of this," she murmured. "Miss Carstairs wouldn't have wanted it." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, expectant. Silence had its own weight, and eventually most found it too heavy to bear. Lydia exhaled slowly. "She was afraid," she admitted. "Not just recently. Always. She never said it outright, but I could see it in the way she checked the locks at night, the way she would startle at the slightest sound." Miss Marple nodded. "Did she ever say why?" Lydia shook her head. "Not directly, but I remember once, a few months ago, she thought she saw someone outside, staring up at her window." A flicker of something passed over Lydia's face, guilt perhaps, or regret. "I told her it was nonsense, that it was just the wind, or a trick of the light, but now—" She swallowed. "Now I wonder if someone really was watching her." Miss Marple let the words settle. Fear left traces, and Eleanor Carstairs had spent years trapped beneath its shadow. And now, that shadow had swallowed her whole. The study was, as it had been left, neat, orderly, as though Eleanor might return at any moment to resume her work. But Miss Marple knew better. She moved carefully, her fingers trailing along the edges of bookshelves, searching not for what was present, but for what had been concealed. And then, there, a row of books slightly misaligned. She pressed gently, and a slim leather-bound journal slipped free from its hiding place. The pages were filled with Eleanor's handwriting, some lines neat, others hurried as though written in distress. But it was not daily musings that filled the pages. It was recollections, notes on something that had haunted Eleanor for years. A name appeared more than once, the ink darker, the pressure of the pen heavier. "Cecilia." Miss Marple turned the pages carefully, piecing together the fragmented entries. A girl who had vanished, a drowning, or so they had claimed. And yet, Eleanor had never believed it. She glanced towards the doorway. Eleanor had hidden this journal for a reason, and now Miss Marple intended to find out why. Cecilia Harrington. The name sat on the page, surrounded by scattered thoughts, half-finished sentences, as though Eleanor had struggled to put the past into words. Miss Marple read on. 30 years ago, Cecilia had disappeared. Drowned, they had said. A tragic accident. The river had claimed her, swift and merciless. But Eleanor had never believed it. She saw her. The words stood alone on the page, underlined twice. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly around the journal. Eleanor had seen Cecilia after her supposed death. It explained the fear, the secrecy. If Cecilia had vanished, then why had Eleanor, all these years later, remained convinced she had lived? There was something more to this story, something buried. And Miss Marple had a feeling that Eleanor's death was no coincidence. The past had come knocking. And this time, it had taken more than just memories. The villagers of Little Marchwood were always willing to share an opinion. But when it came to Cecilia Harrington, recollections varied. "Oh yes, a dreadful tragedy," said Mrs. Hargreaves, adjusting her apron. "Fell into the river, poor girl. The current was strong that year." Mr. Thomas, the grocer, frowned. "I remember it well. There was a search, of course, but no body was ever found. A few of us thought that was odd." Miss Marple listened, nodding, letting the stories unfold. Some swore Cecilia had been reckless, prone to wandering too close to the water's edge. Others insisted she had been a sensible girl, unlikely to have drowned so carelessly. But one detail stood out above all. Eleanor Carstairs had never believed it. She used to say Cecilia didn't drown at all, Mrs. Hargreaves admitted hesitantly. That she'd seen something that night. Something that didn't sit right. Miss Marple clasped her hands together. "And did anyone listen?" A pause, then a quiet sigh. "Eleanor was young then. People thought she was grieving, imagining things." Miss Marple's gaze remained thoughtful. Imagination was one thing, but a woman who had carried that doubt for 30 years, that was something else entirely. That night, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant hoot of an owl. Miss Marple sat by the window of her guest room, her knitting needles idle in her lap. Carstairs Manor was silent, save for the faint creaks of an old house settling into the night. And then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the garden hedge, still, watching. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Miss Marple did not rise, did not stir. She merely observed, her sharp gaze unblinking. The figure was cloaked in shadow, but something about the stance, the intent behind the lingering presence, sent a prickle of unease through her. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure melted into the darkness. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment longer before setting her knitting aside. Eleanor had been afraid, and now, it seemed, she had good reason to be. Morning came with a heavy mist rolling across the grounds, shrouding Carstairs Manor in an eerie stillness. Miss Marple descended to breakfast, her mind already tracing the threads of what she had learned. Cecilia's disappearance had been ruled an accident, but Eleanor had never accepted that. A hidden journal, whispers of doubt, and now, someone lurking in the dark. It was not coincidence. It was history, demanding to be heard. Lydia Fairfax poured tea with careful hands, her gaze flickering to Miss Marple. "Did you sleep well?" Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "Well enough, though I do wonder. Has anyone else ever mentioned seeing a stranger near the estate?" Lydia's grip on the teapot tightened. "Number? No, I don't believe so." A lie, not outright, but enough. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Eleanor had spent years haunted by the past. Now, it seemed, someone was determined to keep that past buried. But Miss Marple had never been one to leave a mystery unsolved. Chapter 4. a most unreliable witness. Reverend Aldous was not an old man, but he carried the weight of one who had seen more than his share of regret. His fingers fidgeted with the spine of a well-worn Bible as Miss Marple sat across from him in the dimly lit vestry. "You knew Eleanor Carstairs well, I imagine," Miss Marple said gently. The Reverend gave a slow nod. "She came here often, more often in her later years. Guilt weighs heavily on a soul, Miss Marple." Miss Marple did not rush him. She merely watched as his gaze drifted toward the window, to the churchyard beyond. "There was something she told me, years ago," he said at last. "Something that troubled her. She claimed she had seen Cecilia." Miss Marple's knitting needles remained still in her lap. "After Cecilia's supposed death?" Aldous swallowed. "Yes." He hesitated. "She told me it was late, and she had been walking near the river, and there, standing by the boathouse, was Cecilia. Not a ghost, not an apparition. Cecilia real as you or me. And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "no one believed her." He sighed. "I did not know what to believe." Miss Marple studied the weary man before her. Regret, she had learned, often spoke louder than guilt. And the Reverend, it seemed, had spent years listening to both. Eleanor's study remained untouched, as though waiting for its occupant to return. But Miss Marple knew the dead seldom reclaimed what they had left behind. She moved with quiet precision, sifting through the careful order of Eleanor's papers. And then, beneath a stack of old receipts, she found something that did not belong. A ledger. The ink was faded, the pages worn from years of use. But the entries were clear. Payments made at irregular intervals, sums withdrawn, always under vague notations. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was not an account of ordinary household expenses. This was something else entirely. Blackmail. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been extorting Eleanor for years. And yet, she had never gone to the police, never spoken of it. Why? Because, Miss Marple suspected, the secret being guarded was not only Eleanor's. She traced a fingertip over the last recorded payment, made only weeks before Eleanor's death. The amount was larger than usual, almost desperate. Had she tried to put an end to it? Had someone decided at last that silence was safer than a continued arrangement? Miss Marple closed the ledger with careful deliberation. Eleanor had paid a price to keep the past buried, and now, it seemed, she had paid with her life. Julian Carstairs prided himself on composure. He had inherited it, he claimed, along with the family estate. A certain refinement, an ability to maintain dignity in all circumstances. But Miss Marple had seen many masks in her time, and she knew when one was beginning to crack. "I was in London that night," Julian said smoothly. "Several people can confirm it." Miss Marple nodded, the slightest tilt of her head. "And yet, you returned quite promptly after your aunt's passing. A rather immediate journey." Julian's fingers tapped idly against the side of his chair. "Naturally, she was my aunt." Miss Marple smiled as if in agreement. "And yet, you do not seem particularly grief-stricken." Julian's jaw tightened. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Miss Marple studied him, her gaze light but unrelenting. "Only that grief, like truth, has a way of revealing itself in time." There it was, the briefest flicker of uncertainty, the kind that came when a man realized he was being observed too closely. Julian exhaled sharply, forcing a smile. "Miss Marple, you are a guest in this house. I would hate for you to overstep." She inclined her head, as though in deference. But Miss Marple had never been one to heed a warning, especially when it came from a man with too much to lose. Miss Marple sat in the dimly lit study, Eleanor's journal resting beside her, the pages worn from time and troubled hands. The lines of ink, scrawled in haste, told a story long forgotten by most. Cecilia Harrington, a girl who had vanished. A drowning, they said. Yet no body had ever been recovered. And now, decades later, Eleanor Carstairs, perhaps the only person who had doubted that story, was dead. Coincidence rarely played a role in murder. Miss Marple traced a finger along the margins of the journal, noting the frantic loops of Eleanor's handwriting. She knows the truth, but does she remember? Had Eleanor, in her final days, recalled something buried deep in her mind? Something that had been waiting in the shadows, patient and unforgiving. A name whispered through the years, a face in the dark. Miss Marple closed the journal gently. Eleanor had known something about Cecilia's fate, and someone had killed her for it. Outside, the air was thick with the promise of rain, a storm brewing. Not just in the sky, but in the silent corridors of Carstairs Manor. Miss Marple sat by the window, her thoughts carefully arranged like pieces of a puzzle. She had seen it before, secrets woven so deeply into the past that their unraveling threatened to destroy those who held them. Eleanor had been silenced, but the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how long it had been buried. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Lydia Fairfax entered, hesitant. "Miss Marple, you ought to be careful." Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "And why is that, my dear?" Lydia hesitated, her fingers twisting together. "Some people, they don't want the past disturbed." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, my dear," she said, "the past is already restless. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of Carstairs Manor, the truth was waiting to be found." Chapter 5. The Vanishing Game. Morning had barely broken when the scream rang out, shrill, sharp, and unmistakably laced with terror. Miss Marple was already at the window when she saw the source of the commotion. In the garden near the overgrown hedges, a small group had gathered, and at the center of it, motionless in the damp grass, lay Lydia Fairfax. She was dressed in the same modest housekeeper's uniform she always wore, but now the crisp white collar was askew, the fabric creased from struggle. Around her neck, a silk scarf, twisted too tightly to be anything but deliberate. Miss Marple descended the staircase with the steadiness of someone who had seen death before. But even she felt a chill at the sight of Lydia's still hands, curled slightly, as though reaching for help that never came. She was only out to cut flowers," stammered one of the maids, barely able to look at the body. "She did it every morning." Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the placement of the body, the disturbed earth nearby, the faint trace of footprints leading back toward the house. This was no random act of violence. Someone had wanted Lydia silenced, and they had succeeded. The air in the drawing room was thick with hushed voices and restless movement. The shock of Lydia's death had sent ripples through the household, but Miss Marple knew better than to mistake grief for fear. This was not the kind of mourning that came from loss. This was the kind that came from knowing something was terribly, terribly wrong. Julian Carstairs paced by the fireplace, his usual composure slipping. "2 deaths in the same house? This is madness." Miss Marple remained seated, her expression unreadable. "Madness or method?" Julian froze. Lydia Fairfax had confided in Miss Marple just the night before, her voice barely above a whisper. She had warned that some secrets were better left buried, and now she had been silenced before she could say any more. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The message was clear. Someone knew she was getting too close. But if the killer had intended to frighten her into retreat, they had made a grave miscalculation. Miss Marple had never been one to turn away from the truth, and she certainly wasn't going to start now. It was later that afternoon, in the quiet solitude of Eleanor's study, that Miss Marple found it. She had been searching for something, she wasn't sure what exactly, when her fingers brushed against the edge of an old envelope, tucked carefully between the pages of a book. She slid it free, unfolding the brittle paper with practiced care. Inside was a photograph. 3 young women stood side by side, smiling at the camera. Eleanor Carstairs on the left, Cecilia Harrington in the center. And the third woman, her face scratched out so violently that only the faintest outline of her features remained. Miss Marple stared at the image, feeling the weight of it settle deep in her bones. Someone had wanted this woman erased, not just forgotten, but obliterated. But memories, like secrets, had a way of resisting silence. Miss Marple traced the jagged marks with a single finger. Who was she? And more importantly, who wanted her name lost to time? The answers were coming. And Miss Marple suspected the killer knew it too. Miss Marple held the photograph in her hands, studying the 3 young women who had once stood together, their faces alight with youth and promise. Eleanor Carstairs on the left, Cecilia Harrington in the center, and the third woman, erased. Someone had wanted her identity lost. But erasure, Miss Marple knew, was never truly complete. She turned the photograph over. There, in faded ink, were only 2 names, Eleanor and Cecilia, summer at Marchwood, 1895. No mention of the third. Miss Marple closed her eyes, reaching back into the tangled web of memory. The village gossip had always spoken of Eleanor and Cecilia, but had there been whispers, faint, half forgotten, of someone else? A friend, a rival? Whoever she had been, she had mattered. Perhaps too much. Miss Marple tucked the photograph safely into her pocket. The answer was here, hidden among the lives of those who had long since learned to keep secrets. She only needed to find the right thread to pull. And then, everything would unravel. A name scratched out. A body never recovered. A woman silenced. Miss Marple had seen patterns before, and this one was unmistakable. This was not a crime of impulse. This was a crime of erasure. Someone had spent years, perhaps decades, ensuring that certain memories faded into obscurity. Cecilia's disappearance had been explained away, Eleanor's doubts dismissed as grief. And now, just as the truth threatened to resurface, Eleanor was dead. Lydia was dead. Miss Marple's fingers curled around the edges of the photograph. Someone had been playing a careful, patient game, removing every loose thread before it could be pulled. But they had miscalculated, because Miss Marple had found the thread they had missed, and she had no intention of letting go. The night air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the hush of Carstairs Manor pressing in on all sides. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the photograph resting on the table before her. She could feel it now. The shift, the tightening of the noose. The killer was growing desperate. Lydia's death had not been planned. It had been hurried, reckless. A warning, yes, but also a sign of panic. Whoever was behind this had controlled the past for years. Now they were losing their grip. Miss Marple glanced toward the window. Somewhere out there, in the quiet dark, the murderer was watching, waiting. She took a slow sip of tea, her mind assembling the final pieces. Time was running out, for the murderer, and for whoever was next. Chapter 6. The Man in the Mirror. Miss Marple had always believed in the power of observation. People, when placed under the right kind of pressure, revealed themselves in ways they never intended. And so, she set the bait. An old letter of Eleanor Carstairs, carefully discovered among her belongings, was passed discreetly to the household. Its contents, fabricated from a mix of truth and speculation, hinted at an unsettling revelation, one that suggested Eleanor had known far more than she had ever let on. Miss Marple did not need to read the letter herself. She only needed to watch. Julian Carstairs received it with forced indifference, his fingers tightening around the paper as his gaze flickered toward the door. Alice Forsyth read it with a cool, unreadable expression, but her hands trembled ever so slightly as she folded it away. Dr. Miles Barton hesitated before even touching it, his eyes scanning the room before he finally picked it up. And as he read, something changed. His jaw clenched, his breath shallowed. Just for a moment, but enough for Miss Marple to see. The reactions were telling. Someone among them knew what Eleanor had been trying to uncover. And now, they were afraid that her words had not died with her. The night was restless. A wind stirred through the trees, rattling branches against the window panes of Carstairs Manor. But Miss Marple, seated in her chair with a book resting idly in her lap, did not hear the wind alone. She heard movement, a careful hand at the latch, a creak of wood, slow and deliberate. Someone was inside the house. She did not stir. Instead, she listened. The soft shuffle of footsteps, the careful pulling out of drawers, the rustle of papers. Whoever it was, they were searching, and they were doing so with an urgency that betrayed desperation. A cupboard door clicked shut. A moment of silence, and then, just as suddenly as they had come, the presence was gone. Miss Marple exhaled softly, setting her book aside. They were afraid enough to take a risk, and fear, she knew, made even the most careful of murderers make mistakes. Dr. Miles Barton had always been a man of controlled composure. But today, Miss Marple noted, there was something different. A stiffness in his shoulders, a certain guardedness in his expression. "I imagine the recent events have been quite distressing for you, Doctor," she said lightly, settling into her chair opposite him. Dr. Barton forced a smile. "For all of us, Miss Marple." She let a silence linger between them, then placed the photograph on the table. The one with Eleanor, Cecilia, and the third woman whose face had been scratched out. Dr. Barton's reaction was instant. His eyes flickered to the image, then away. His throat moved as he swallowed. A nervous tick, a tell. "You knew her," Miss Marple said quietly. Dr. Barton exhaled, forcing a chuckle. "Miss Marple, I hardly see how this is relevant." Miss Marple simply waited. Another silence. Another moment where the air felt thick with unspoken words. And then, for the first time, Dr. Barton looked unsure. Not guilty? Not yet. But afraid. And Miss Marple intended to find out why. Dr. Miles Barton sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Across from him, Miss Marple observed with quiet patience. "You knew Cecilia Harrington well, Doctor," she said gently. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his cufflinks. "I did. Many years ago." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "More than just an acquaintance, I believe." A flicker of something crossed his face, wary, reluctant. Then, as if conceding to the inevitable, he nodded. "We were engaged," he admitted, briefly, before she disappeared." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting. The word was carefully chosen, deliberate. Not before she died, but before she disappeared. "And Eleanor knew." Dr. Barton hesitated, then gave a short nod. "She didn't approve. Thought we were mismatched." A humorless chuckle. "She wasn't entirely wrong." Miss Marple studied him carefully. An engagement hidden from most. A woman who vanished without a trace, and a man who had done his best to forget. But the past, she knew, was rarely so accommodating. Dr. Barton shifted in his seat, his usual composure unraveling thread by thread. "I had nothing to do with Cecilia's disappearance," he said firmly. Miss Marple did not respond immediately. Instead, she observed the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his left eye flickered when he spoke, the hurried sip of tea before he continued. "You must understand," he went on. "It was a long time ago. I loved her, yes, but people, they grow apart." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind. "Of course, Doctor. And yet," she folded her hands primly in her lap, "whenever you deny involvement, you touch your collar." Dr. Barton stiffened. "I beg your pardon." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. "It's quite fascinating. A little nervous tic, perhaps. Every time you insist you had nothing to do with Cecilia's fate, your hand moves to your collar." Dr. Barton let out a forced laugh. "That's absurd." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. "But I do wonder, Doctor, are you denying something to me? Or to yourself?" A heavy silence stretched between them, and Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though some remained just out of reach. Cecilia's disappearance, Eleanor's relentless search for the truth, Lydia's sudden death, and now Dr. Barton, a man who had spent decades carefully avoiding the past. Miss Marple watched him closely. His reluctance was not guilt, not yet. It was something else. Fear. He knew more than he was willing to admit, and someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that the past remained buried. Miss Marple rose to leave, offering him a gentle smile. "I do appreciate your time, Doctor." Dr. Barton hesitated, as if debating whether to say something more, but in the end he simply nodded, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple stepped outside into the crisp evening air, her mind already weaving the final threads of the mystery together. Dr. Barton was hiding something, and the truth, however long it had remained buried, was about to come to light. Chapter 7. The Truth Buried Beneath. The answer had been there all along, scattered in the margins of Eleanor's journals, buried beneath decades of misdirection. But now, as Miss Marple carefully pieced together the remnants of the past, a singular truth emerged. Eleanor Carstairs had intended for her fortune to go to Cecilia Harrington, not Julian, not distant relatives, not charities or trustees. Cecilia. Miss Marple sat back, her hands resting lightly on the brittle pages of an old unsigned will. The document had been carefully hidden, tucked away in a ledger beneath meaningless financial records, as if Eleanor had known it was dangerous. And dangerous it had proven to be, because if Cecilia had disappeared before the will could be executed, that meant everything, every last shilling, had fallen into the hands of someone else, someone who had benefited greatly from her absence. Miss Marple's lips pressed together. The motive had always been there, just waiting to be uncovered. Had Eleanor, in her final days, remembered this? Had she realized the mistake, the crime that had been allowed to stand unchallenged for 30 years? And had that knowledge cost her life? The past, Miss Marple knew, never stayed buried forever, and now the truth was clawing its way to the surface. The old boathouse stood at the edge of the lake, abandoned for years, its wooden planks weathered by time and neglect. It had been here, decades ago, that Cecilia Harrington was last seen. Miss Marple stepped carefully inside, the musty scent of damp wood and forgotten memories thick in the air. This place had been left to rot, like a secret no one wished to confront. But secrets, Miss Marple had learned, had a habit of lingering. She ran her fingers along the dusty shelves, her sharp gaze scanning the floor, the beams, the walls, searching for something, anything that time had failed to erase. Eleanor had believed Cecilia did not drown, that she had lived beyond that night. If she was right, then there had to be proof. Miss Marple's gaze landed on the floorboards near the far wall, slightly uneven, as if they had been disturbed long ago. She knelt, pressing her hand against the wood. It shifted, loose as if hiding something beneath, a secret, waiting to be uncovered. She inhaled deeply. The past was no longer content to remain in the shadows. Miss Marple worked patiently, prying up the loosened plank with steady hands. Beneath it, nestled in the dust and decay of forgotten years, something gleamed, a brooch. She lifted it carefully, brushing away the dirt. The design was intricate, a delicate silver setting, worn with age but still unmistakably beautiful. And at its center, a single faded engraving, to Cecilia, with love. Miss Marple's breath caught. This was not merely jewelry. This was proof. Cecilia had been here, not in the river, not swept away by an unfortunate accident. Here. Had she hidden? Had she tried to escape? And if so, who had ensured she never made it out? Miss Marple closed her fingers around the brooch. Someone had spent 30 years ensuring Cecilia's story remained untold. And now, with this single piece of forgotten evidence, the truth was finally slipping through their grasp. It would not remain hidden much longer. The air was thick with tension as Julian Carstairs strode into the drawing room, his face dark with anger. Behind him, Henry Forsyth followed, his usual cool demeanor replaced by something sharper, more brittle. "This has gone far enough," Julian snapped, his voice taut with barely concealed fury. "Digging through Eleanor's things, stirring up the past. This is not your concern, Miss Marple." Miss Marple, seated calmly in her chair, regarded him with a serene expression. "And yet, Mr. Carstairs, you seem rather invested in ensuring I stop." Henry scoffed, folding his arms. "It's morbid. Eleanor is dead. Let her rest." Miss Marple sighed, setting her knitting aside. "It is quite extraordinary," she mused. "How many people insist on forgetting the past when it is so very much alive?" Julian's jaw tightened. "You don't understand." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "Then why not help me, Mr. Carstairs? Why not tell me what happened that night, all those years ago?" Julian's hands curled into fists at his sides. Across the room, Henry shifted uneasily. Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. And then, Julian made a mistake. Julian's anger flared, his voice rising before he could stop himself. "We buried her, and she still won't stay dead." A stunned silence filled the room. Henry Forsyth turned sharply toward Julian, his face pale. "Julian, for God's sake." But the damage was done. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her sharp gaze locking onto Julian like a needle finding its mark. "We buried her," she repeated softly. "Not she drowned, not she was lost, but we buried her." Julian's face drained of color, his mouth opened, then closed. Henry exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You fool." Miss Marple's voice was gentle but unyielding. "Cecilia did not drown, did she?" Julian took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to erase his own words from existence. But there was no undoing them now. The past had returned, and with it, the truth. Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly, every clue, every unanswered question clicking into place. Cecilia had never drowned. She had been murdered. The will, hidden away, leaving Eleanor's fortune to her. The fearful whispers, the attempts to erase every trace of Cecilia's existence. Eleanor had known. Perhaps not all of it, perhaps not at first, but something had haunted her, something she had never been able to forget. She had spent her life trying to atone for her silence, and when she had finally begun to speak, she had been silenced for good. Miss Marple looked at Julian, at Henry. One of them had killed Cecilia, and now the past they had buried was clawing its way back to the surface. Miss Marple exhaled softly. It was almost over. The final truth was within reach, and she would not stop until justice was done. Final chapter. The mystery that almost broke her. The drawing room of Carstairs Manor was suffused with a heavy stillness, broken only by the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock. Miss Marple sat at the center of it all, her gaze calm but unwavering, as she surveyed the faces before her. Julian Carstairs, pale and fidgeting, avoided her eyes. Henry Forsyth sat stiffly, arms folded, his usual composure betrayed by the tension in his jaw, and Alice Forsyth, seated quietly by the window, wore an expression of carefully cultivated detachment. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythm that seemed almost soothing, until she spoke. 30 years ago, a young woman named Cecilia Harrington vanished. Officially, it was ruled a drowning, but Eleanor Carstairs never believed that. She paused, letting her words settle. And now, 2 deaths later, I think we all know that Cecilia's story did not end in the lake. Julian shifted uncomfortably. Henry glanced toward Alice, who remained perfectly still. Eleanor tried to right a terrible wrong. Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but implacable. She knew what had really happened to Cecilia, and she knew who was responsible. That knowledge cost her her life. Silence hung in the air like a storm about to break. And then, Miss Marple turned her gaze to Alice. "It was you, wasn't it, Mrs. Forsyth?" Miss Marple's voice was soft, but her words landed like a blow. Alice's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair. "This is absurd," she said, her voice steady but brittle. "I had nothing to do with any of this." Miss Marple gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "You were Cecilia's closest friend. You knew her secrets. And when Eleanor remembered the truth and tried to reveal it, you silenced her." Julian shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's gaze never left Alice. "You see, my dear, secrets have a way of clinging to those who try to bury them. Eleanor's hidden will, the photograph with the face scratched out, the brooch hidden in the floorboards, all of it led back to you." Alice's face was pale now, her carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of the truth. "You don't understand," she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Oh, but I do. You weren't protecting yourself, were you? You were protecting someone else." For a moment, Alice said nothing. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words spilled out. "I had no choice," she said, her voice shaking. "She was going to ruin everything." Alice's hands trembled as she spoke, the weight of 30 years of secrets pressing down on her. "Cecilia fell in love with the wrong man," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She wanted to expose what he had done. She thought love would protect her." Miss Marple listened, her expression soft but unrelenting. "She came to me," Alice continued, tears streaming down her face now. "She begged me to help her. But if she had told the truth, it wouldn't have just ruined him. It would have destroyed all of us." Her voice cracked. "I couldn't let her do that." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "So you silenced her." Alice's head dropped into her hands. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. But she wouldn't listen. She wouldn't stop." The room was silent, save for Alice's quiet sobs. Julian stared at the floor, his face ashen. Henry sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting forgotten. Eleanor spent her life trying to atone for her silence. She carried the burden of that night until it cost her everything. She paused, but she never gave up. Alice looked up, her eyes red and swollen. I just wanted it to go away. Miss Marple's gaze softened. The truth never goes away, my dear. And with that, the mystery that had haunted Carstairs Manor for 30 years was finally laid to rest. Eleanor Carstairs had spent her final years trapped beneath the weight of an unbearable truth. She had known what happened to Cecilia. Perhaps not all of it at first, but enough. Enough to know that an injustice had been committed, and that her own silence had allowed it to stand. And so she had tried in her own way to make amends. The hidden will, the careful inquiries, the cryptic letters sent in the dead of night. Eleanor had not forgotten, nor had she forgiven herself. But guilt, as Miss Marple well knew, was a dangerous thing. It made people reckless. It made them desperate. And in Eleanor's case, it had made her a target. Her murder had not been an act of passion or revenge. It had been an act of preservation. Someone had needed her to remain silent, just as Cecilia had been silenced all those years ago. But Eleanor had underestimated one thing. The past was never truly buried. And now, after all this time, the truth had finally been exhumed. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her small cottage, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls. The case was over. The guilty had been exposed. Justice, in some form, had been served. And yet, a heaviness remained. She had always believed that truth was a noble pursuit, that bringing light to darkness was a duty. But now, she wondered, had Cecilia, all those years ago, believed the same? Had she thought the truth would protect her, only to find that some secrets refused to be unearthed without consequence? Miss Marple sighed, folding her hands in her lap. She knew, in the end, that she would always choose to pursue the truth. It was simply her nature. But there were moments, rare and fleeting, when she wondered, was it always the right thing to do? The photograph lay on the table before her. 3 young women, frozen in time. Eleanor, elegant and watchful. Cecilia, bright-eyed, unaware of what lay ahead. And the third woman, Alice Forsyth, who had once been a friend before, fear had turned her into something else. Miss Marple traced a finger along the faded edges of the image. She had solved the case. She had uncovered the truth. And yet, as she looked at Cecilia's face, she could not shake the thought. This was the closest she had ever come to failing. The past had almost won. Almost. Miss Marple exhaled softly, then tucked the photograph away. Some mysteries lingered, some wounds never fully healed, and some, like Cecilia's, took far too long to be seen.